All right, so we're going to be focusing on a couple things today. The first thing that we're going to be looking at is building a works cited page, right? And talking about kind of how we go through and make a works cited and what some of the strategies are to putting that together. And then the next thing that we're going to do is look at conclusion paragraph. So we'll look at some different examples. That's the other than kind of working on your essay. The only thing that you have to turn in this week is just the works cited page. I like to have you do the works cited page before you turn in the paper the first time through, just because pretty straightforward. Like once you do one, some of you may have done them before. Sometimes it's maybe your first time, but once you do one and kind of have an idea of like what it's supposed to look like I'll check them as I'm grading your homework, and then you'll be able to know, okay, cool, I got this exactly right. Now all you do is just copy and paste this into my paper, and it's done. So work cited is one of those things where I think it's important that we spend time talking about MLA format, but I also think that it's one of those things that we don't even a ton of time focusing on. And one of the big reasons because time, um, I think the way that we do works cited pages, because it's already changing, is going to be relatively obsolete, right? Like I'll show you an example today. You've seen some of this in your LR10 classes, but like we could just have things automatically generate works cited pages for us. When you're doing your research paper at the end of the semester, there'll be automatic citations you're able to pull just directly from, you know, EBSCOhost or whatever online database you're using. So to really spend a ton of time, like, you know, learning how to go through things kind of like the old fashioned way, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Because imagine, you know, in the next year, I don't really see us use a lot of these kind of old strategies to do it. The other reason is that you're going to be writing for different formats depending on what discipline you're writing for. This may be, you know, after your English classes, English 2 or English 4, this may be your last time ever writing an MLA format, right? Unless you're majoring in some of the humanities, like you're not be writing an MLA format. If you're a nursing major, for example, you'd be APA format. So there's just so many different writing styles that to only focus on MLA and to spend a ton of time focusing on MLA really make a lot of sense, because and you may never write an MLA format again. And so I think it's, you know, for me, the most important thing that we focus on with MLA formatting and works cited pages and things like that is really this idea of understanding the need to cite our sources. We talked about that, came to like, you know, in-text citation and paraphrasing and things like that, just because that's what's most important, is like letting your reader know, here is where I got these ideas from. These ideas in this essay are in fact not my original ideas. And then also works cited pages are really helpful because when you're doing your research, and we'll talk about this later on in the semester, but when you're doing your research, there's going to be times where you've read something and you're like, oh, I want to read what that person also wrote, right? Like, or what did that person read in order to be able to write this essay? Like, I do that with movies all the time, right? Like, I watch a movie, I'm like, this movie was fantastic, or this show was great, or I love this actor or actress in this show. So then I'll go to their IMDb and I'll be like, what else have they done? Because now I want to watch more of it, right? What did this director also direct? And then I'll go and I'll check that out. And it's kind of similar with research, right? Maybe not as kind of fun and exciting of a way, right? But it is, I guess, cool in its own way when you get into it, right? Where you could like be reading somebody's stuff, right? Think about that with a band. Be like, here's a band that I love. What bands they listen to in order to help them develop their sound? And so one of the things that we do is we use writers' works cited pages to be able to go back and say, I want to be able to find the research this person used. I want to read it myself. I want to have the same framework they do. And we could just go to the works cited page and find out exactly where it's at. So that's another really strong reason, you know, to focus on works cited, because we'll use them as tools when we're doing our own research. So let's take a quick look. Let me share my screen with you and we'll take a look into Canvas at the information that you're going to need. There we go. Okay. So in case, oops, there we go. I posted all that you're gonna have to do for the assignment this week, right? Which is just create a works cited page. So all of the information, because I photocopied, you know, some of the stuff, scanned it for you, the blind spot chapter, right? But all the information that you're going to need to be able to write your works cited pages entries for each of these three is written right in here. Trevor Noah's book, you have his book. I'll also show you like a quick little auto bib way of looking it up. Danger of a Single Story, here's the URL that you need to be able to get to it. You could also cite it as a YouTube video, and I'll show you the difference there. And then the last one is citing Blind Spot, the book, right? And here's the publication information that you need to be able to do that. So when we create works cited pages, those are different than in-text citations because a works cited is you're citing the entire piece of work, right? So you only have to write one entry for each source that you use. So even if you quote Trevor Noah's book 4 times in your essay, you don't have to do 4 different separate entries for that, right? All you do is at the end, you write your works cited page. Your works cited page is the last page in your essay. It's its own page, right? You don't put it at the end of the writing. It's just a completely new page. But also it's one of those things just for like other reference. That's why now we talk about writing in word counts, but it doesn't count as a page in your essay. So it's not like, hey, write a 5-page paper. The 5th page is the works cited page. It's like 5 pages of content, and then the works cited page is its own thing. So just know that when you're finished writing your essay, then you move on to a new page, and then your works cited page is the final page of your essay. So for this essay, let's imagine you use 2 sources, then you would only have 2 entries in the works cited page. So I think a pretty valuable tool to be able to figure out like how to put a works cited together, and we'll come back to this just so we have this information here, is just using University to Purdue's OWL, right? Like this is a great resource. I've showed this before. I've linked this multiple times in Canvas. Chris has mentioned this also. Like it's great, it's free, and it's constantly being updated, right? So you don't have to worry about like finding old sources, and that's really important for works cited pages, for example, because things change, right? And maybe sometimes the grammar rules don't change, even though there are times where those change, right? Like we're seeing some pretty big changes happening grammatically with talking about like 3rd person singular pronouns, right? In the past, using there as a 3rd person singular pronoun, if I was reading a grammar book from 10 years ago, there would be no context where that would be grammatically correct. Now, because thinking about things from a non-binary gender standpoint, they, them, right? Something like that is a 3rd person singular pronoun works. It's no longer just he and she. And so I think that there are instances where we see grammar change, right? Because we use grammar as a tool for our language. And so we kind of dictate the way we use it. But that's fairly rare, right? Where like some of the hard and fast rules change. Where a lot of the rules start to change is with works cited. Because, for example, I don't know, Twitter. In the past, there wasn't an example of how to cite a tweet because Twitter didn't exist, or it wasn't really viewed as something people would cite in their writing. Same thing with YouTube, or I imagine now you could even cite like possibly a TikTok video. I've never had to do it. I probably never will do it in a paper, but I imagine that there's a way that you could say, how do I format this citation? Just like you could a works cited format for a YouTube video. So using OWL is really good instead of buying a handbook, because when these things change, OWL can just kind of quickly update those things. So I'm just going to do a search because I feel like that's usually a pretty easy way to be able to navigate through these different websites. And I'll just write MLA works cited. So as soon as you pull up MLA cited, there's basic format, right? There's a sample works cited page. And so we're just going to look at a sample works cited page just to kind of get an idea formatting of what these look like, right? Because they're going to look a little bit different than maybe some of the things that we're used to. So here's an example of a works cited page sample, right? And all I did was I just did a quick little search on Purdue's OWL for works cited, right? And so one of the things that you're going to notice is it still stays double spaced, right? Because it's consistent with the rest of your essay. It's still the Word document or Google Doc or whatever you're working on. But one of the big differences is look at the way the indentations work. Notice when you look at the works cited page, like there's no number before any of the entries. It's not like source number 1, source number 2. There's none of that, right? The way that we can tell one entry from another entry is because we use hanging indentations. So hanging indentations are just backwards indentations. So instead of indenting the first line of each paragraph, right, with tab and moving it over, in works cited pages, we indent the second line on. So you can see this first entry here by this writer's last name, Dean, it's not indented. The second line of this article is indented. Same thing, look at this third entry. The second line and the third line are indented after John Gowdy's article, but the first line is not. that's how we're able to differentiate where one ends and the next one begins. So it's that hanging indentation. And I really want you to just kind of practice that, because that's how I'll know, or your reader will know when they're looking at your works cited page, where one entry ends and the next begins. Not because we number them, but because we have those hanging indentations that make that really clear for the reader. The next thing that you'll notice when you look at this works cited page is that there's arranged not in the order that you would put them in your paper, but they're arranged alphabetically by writer's last name, right? So in this case, depending on whichever sources that you use, right? If you're using Adiche and you're using Trevor Noah, even if you used, first, you would create an entry for Adiche first, because her last name comes before Trevor Noah's last name, right? So you'll arrange your works cited page alphabetically and make sure that you have those hanging indentations so your reader knows where one entry ends and the next one begins. Any questions at all about this so far?
Yeah, I've got one thing to add to that. Just
Yeah, please.
from a logistics perspective, like when you're making hanging indents, make sure that go to the second line and hit enter and then tab. That's something that frequently comes up, because if you just hit tab on the second line, it moves the whole thing over and it's really
Yeah,
annoying. So just
yeah,
remember,
that's a
like,
really good
enter
point.
then tab.
And if, you know, I'm showing you this because there are going to be instances, and I always tell, students about these experiences that I've had where, like, and I know Chris has had them before in college, maybe some of you have had them too, where like instructors just will not read your work if it's not appropriately formatted. There are some people that are like really, really strict about this. I'm not, right? It might be the difference of a point or two, but it will never be the difference of a letter grade. It'll never be a, I won't read this paper, anything like that, right? So it's like, I think it's important because
Mhm.
even though it's not something that I put a lot of value in when it comes to grading, I know that there are going to be those situations where there are going to be people who do. And so I kind of think about like a well formatted paper and a grammatically sound paper as like being analogous to wearing dress clothes to an interview. I would recommend
Yeah.
that you dress nice to go to a job interview. I don't think that defines you. I don't think it defines your ideas or the person you are or what you can bring to that position that you're applying for. But I think it's a good idea, because the reality is if you go into a job interview and I go in dressed like I'm dressed right now with like workout pants, some sort of comfortable little slipper things, and hit a comfortable shirt, like I'm not going to be taken seriously. And even though my ideas don't change and who I am doesn't change, the way that I'm being judged at the surface does. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that when it comes to grammar. I don't necessarily agree with it, and I don't agree with it when it comes to formatting, but there's been a lot of pretty compelling and convincing research that has showed, like, people, like, for example, sorting papers. Like, a group came in, looked at like essays that you would write, a standardized exam, something like that, and sorting them. And just based off of what the paper looks like, how everything's indented, how long the paragraphs look, not reading a single word, how the name is put on the paper, is it put in the right place, things like that, and sorted them into what papers would pass and what papers wouldn't. And that was well aligned with the way that the group graded. So I think that there's something to be said about like the judgment that people make based off of what they see at kind of first impression. And so I think that that's just kind of a good strategy to think about. And like I said, even though I could really care less about the dress clothes thing, I would recommend it. And I do when I job interview, like dress a certain way before I go into that room. Right. And so I think it's kind of the same thing here. So that's like a quick little sample of what a works cited page would look like. Right. So now, what do we at some different examples? Right. If you look over here on the left hand side, these are all breaking down ML formatting, right? So works cited page basic format, how to cite books, how to cite periodicals, and how to cite electronic sources. So the two that we're going to be looking at right now are how to cite books, right? Because for sure, Blind Spot and Trevor Noah's are going to fit under how to cite books, and then electronic sources. That's where we're going to be using a DJ's article. So I'm just going to click over here, how to cite books. Now it's just going to bring up example book basic format, book by one author, book by more than one author. So that's Trevor Noah's book, and that's Blind Spot, right? Because Blind Spot, Banaji, and Greenwald, you have two different writers. Trevor Noah, you have one writer. the most valuable thing that I hope that you take away from hearing me talk about works cited, and I know it's a pretty boring topic for the most part, is that people don't have this kind of stuff memorized, right? Like maybe somewhere there's someone who does, people who, you know, are in charge of MLA who love this kind of stuff, the Modern Language Association, maybe they have it all memorized. I certainly don't. And I think it's kind of a waste of time to worry about how to memorize this kind of stuff. But I do know how to be able to look it up. And I think that's what's most important, right? Is that I could just go to a resource like this, Google it, look up how to cite a book, say, oh, here's an example. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing for Trevor Noah. That's it. That's literally as simple as this is. Copy it absolutely identically to the format that they give you, but with the information that you have. So for example, here, it wants me to put the writer's last name, the writer's first name, the title of the book in italics, the city of the publication, the publisher, and the publication date. So that's it, right? And so this is what's really important is when you're looking at this example, and I'm just going to open up my word processor really quick so we'll do one together. When you're looking at this example, you want to make sure that you copy it down exactly as it is, identically, because change something around. If you forget to put a period in there where a period's supposed to be, if you know, put a comma where there's no comma, then even though that's small potatoes, like it's not that big of a deal, it's technically not in MLA format. And if it's not in MLA format, then it's not correct, right? And so that's what's really important to think about is that you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is identically in that format. So let me share my word processor really quick, and we'll just look at Trevor Noah's together. There we go. Okay, so I need to be able to have his information, right? And it's just super simple. All we need is his book to do it. If you don't have his book, reason by now, or whatever version of the book you're using, you could just, you know, find it online. You'll find all this information that you need. So super duper straightforward, right? So I just grab his book and all the information that I need is just right in here. So obviously I need his last name. Then before his first name, you have to make sure that you have that comma and then period, right? And now so far so good. Then I have to put the title of the books in italics, right? So this is really important that even though that period again seems really small, you want to make sure that you put that there because if not, it's not an MLA format. So if it's not perfect, if it's not identical, then it's not in format. Just like I use the analogy of wearing a uniform. Even though something small is different in the uniform, if it's not identical, it's not in format, right? So then Born a Crime, and his book has a subtitle, just like Greenwald does, which is Stories of a South African Childhood, or sorry, Stories from a South African Childhood. Anytime that you run across something that has a subtitle, you just put a colon, the two dots, one on top of each other, after the main title before the subtitle. You'll see that a lot in articles, right? Banaji Greenwald's book Blind Spot has a subtitle. This book has a subtitle. A lot of times we'll see that with movies will have subtitles, right? Like I don't know, like if you think about like I don't know, the Lord of the Rings movies, those all have subtitles or books, right? Or Twilight, they all have subtitles, right? And so like there's situations where a lot of times subtitles just give you a little bit more information of what it's about, right? So after the title of the book, then I have to have a period, right? Make sure my italics are off. And then I move on to the city publication. That information, like everything that you're going to need is going to be just right in like the third page. There's kind of like a basic book information, right? So if I look randomly for like city publication, the city of publication here is New York. Then all I have to do after that is make sure I put a K at the end of New York, right? After city publication, comma, then the publisher. So publisher for this book is Penguin Random House. And then the last piece of the puzzle that I'm missing is a comma and the publication date. So you might have a book that's like a different edition, right? Like, I don't know, sometimes they reprint books. Just put whatever the date is that they have as the most current one, 2016, period. That's it. The only thing that I'm missing is that I'm missing my hanging indentation. So just to kind of go back to what Chris said, I just hit enter, I hit tab, my indentation hangs, and now I'm done. So literally that's as simple as it is. Like, all I did was I used the format that I pulled from Purdue's OWL. I get exactly the way that it tells me what to do. I copy the information directly from Trevor Noah's book, or directly from the information I provided you on Canvas, or directly from, you know, the link that I posted from Danger of a Single Story, and then copy the information, switch out the information from what the sources that I'm using, and the works cited entry is done. Any questions at all about that? Like, it's really straightforward. You know what I mean? Like, I don't really spend a whole lot more time than this, because all it really is just like, here's the format. It kind of reminds me of like one of those like color by number things, right? Like, my kids have this app and my wife plays it a lot too. And all it is like these little pictures. Like, you just kind of like, number one should be color, number one should be blue. And you just tap it and the whole thing colors blue. And it's like the same idea. Like, you'll just be able to make this works cited page by just following the format that it gives you. Yeah, Gladys, you had a quick question. Or Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, so I already turned in this week's assignment, and
Mhm.
after I clicked submit, I realized I made like a few mistakes in my citations. So I was wondering if I could still fix it, or if that's how I.
Sure. You can email it to me if you want to. That's fine.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Just shoot me an email, because I haven't graded those yet. Just send me an email and just say, hey, here's my updated works cited, and then I'll grade that one instead.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Of course. So the only other thing that I want to show you, let me leave this and go over here, is like those websites like AutoBib. Because I think these are also pretty helpful, right? There's a ton of them, which is like just automatic like works cited generators. They work pretty well. EasyBib is another one, right? And it literally, all you have to do is you just choose the format that you want it to be, and that's really important, right? You want to make sure you don't create an APA format for Trevor Noah's book or whatever. And then all you do is you just punch in the booker, which you'll find just on the back jacket of a book or on the back cover of the book. So I just popped in, there's the ISBN, and then I just click get citation. And there it is. So that's another really effective way to do it. The only thing is, you can copy and paste this into your Word document or Google Doc or whatever the case is. But the only thing you want to make sure is that the formatting doesn't get all mussed up, because sometimes the font is a little smaller, or the color of the text is kind of like a dark gray of a black. Again, not a huge deal, but like, I think it would be nice just to go back through and like make sure that you're updated with whatever the current like font is that you have, so it's consistent with the rest of your paper. Any questions at all on creating works cited?
Hey, Professor, you said that we use the most recent publication,
Yes.
or okay, because mine's
Just think,
a paperback,
go ahead.
and it says 2019.
That's
It's
right.
it was one world and imprint Random House. Okay, so it's still Penguin Random House. It's just 2019, not 2016.
Exactly. When this book came out at first, there wasn't a paperback version of it. Like, sometimes they'll do that. They'll do like an early edition, and then the first edition or whatever will be hardback. Then a paperback will come out like a couple years later. Or there might be an instance where like they'll change something or add something to a book, or have like a new forward or an update. Like, I imagine Blind Spot will do that soon, right? Like, especially with a lot of conversations that are happening in the country about implicit bias, that like, let's say they wanted to come out with like a new edition. So whatever the most current one. So in your case, Anthony, you'd use 2019.
Okay. And the other thing is in LR10, like they
Mhm.
also talk about, citing and so there's a MLA format or whatever. They also have additions. Like we're up to MLA 8 now,
Right.
and there's differences between 7 and 8.
That's right.
And we were cautioned against the auto bib
Mhm.
things you use. Like sometimes they're still set up for 7,
Right.
and if we just copied it over in LR10, we were told that if we didn't fix it and made it edition 8, it would still not be correct.
Yeah, so that's one of those things. That's a really good point. Thank you. That's one of those things that you want to. I always double check them if I'm using something like AutoBid, because there are those times where like one of my friends has one of those, the Tesla Model X that drives itself, but he's not going to fall asleep when that thing is driving. And even though like I was in it with him and he put like some of the auto drive stuff on, and there's still kind of this like want to like hold on to the steering wheel when it's kind of doing what it does on the road, right? And so I think it's like kind of the same idea, except for nowhere near as cool, where it's like when we use some of these things that are online that automatically generate, I still would double check it, right? So I would just, you could double check it with like a quick glance. Sometimes there could be just like they forgot to put a period or the auto generator did whatever. But that's another, to your point, Anthony, that's why I really like using Purdue's OWL versus using a handbook, is because I have an old like large MLA handbook that I probably spent close to $100 on once upon a time, is completely obsolete now because it's not MLA 8, or old, writing handbooks like Simon and Schuster's that are well over $100 that aren't MLA 8, right? So that's a nice part of like using online sources, is that a lot of stuff like Purdue's OWL, especially because it's more trustworthy than AutoBib because it's put out by a university, it's a quality source, that'll be one of those places where you could just check that and double check some of your entries.
Yeah, another thing that happens a lot with those like automatic bibliography websites is sometimes they'll just ask you for like the name of the book, and you'll put in the name of the book and they'll give you like a completely different edition of that book that they're
Right.
citing. That's a really common thing. So yeah, there's still good resources, but it's definitely worthwhile to go back and double check to make sure things match up.
Yep. Yeah, because you might get an edition, like if you put in Board of Crime, there's also a young adult version, adapted version of this book, where like it changes some of the stuff around to make it more appropriate for probably like, people who are like 12 years old. It changes some of the content, the stuff that might be like a little bit, controversial for some people to feel that way about a kid reading. And so like you could put in Board of Crime and you could get a completely different version of the book. So let's take a look then at conclusion. And if there are more questions, if you start working on a works cited page, and anything like that, and you're like stuck with it, and that's why it's just a simple little homework assignment, is I just want to make sure that people feel like, oh, I got an idea of what I'm doing with this. But if you'd like to, meet with one of us and run it by us, like I'm happy to look at it with you and answer any questions you have as you're working on it. And this will be something that we'll continue to talk about, like when we move on to the next essay, and especially into the research project. Okay, so let's take a look then at conclusion. Share my screen. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about like closing out essays, right? We didn't move into this last time. We're going to continue to develop some strategies with looking at conclusions. Last time, we just talked about introduction and body paragraphs before we started working on the first essay. This time I want to spend a little bit of time, not a ton, talking about conclusions, but it's one of those things that we're going to work on into the next essay and definitely into the one after that. So it's kind of just like this reoccurring thing that we're going to work on and developing. So what do people already know about concluding paragraphs? Who has some different ideas of what a conclusion is, what you should be doing, anything like that?
To sum up with what you wrote.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the things that you want to do in a conclusion, is sum up what you write. Good. What else should we be doing in a conclusion, or what else do you know about conclusions? Any other ideas? summing up is a big part of it, right? But do you think a conclusion should just be a summary of all the ideas in your paper, or should there be anything additional happening in a conclusion? Think about any other situation conclusion. What about like a movie? Think about, or a TV show, right? That's always one of the things for me that makes me feel like when I get to the end of a series, like I almost get a little bit nervous. Like, is it going to end well? Right. Like, and then sometimes it gets controversial. Like, I remember like people were angry at Game of Thrones when it ended because they're like, the ending was horrible or it was good, or people are mad at different TV shows about the way it ended or this, that, and the other. It's like there's a lot of pressure with ending. What's something do we expect of an end of a movie, or we expect of an end of a TV show, maybe? Also conclusion. So summing up ideas, but what else?
Like a thrill?
Yeah, it could be a thrill. Sometimes I want to be like that feeling of shock, right? Like I want closure, right? I don't really want, like, sometimes there's open ends, right? Like sometimes there's these ideas of like maybe things just don't end perfectly. I remember I was watching this TV show, which, like, if people have never watched The Wire before, it was my favorite TV show ever made. It's on like an HBO show about Baltimore and like drugs and all sorts of different elements of like what goes into it, and like police and gang activity, and just like it's a phenomenal show. But at any rate, without getting too much into why I love The Wire, like at the end of the show, I was like expecting there to be like this big amazing ending, and the show just kind of ended, and there were so many different like things that weren't ever closed, right? There were open ends, and I was like, at first, like, super disappointed with the ending of the show, because I was like, where's my resolution? What happens to this character? What happened to that guy? Did they catch the bad guys? Did they do this? Did they do that? And it's like, oh, wait a minute. That problem still hasn't ended, right? Like, there's still people who are addicted to drugs. There's still police violence. There's still, crime happening in Baltimore. This is still something that's happening in this community. So they're not going to give it some perfect storybook ending, because there's no such thing as that. Right. So sometimes we want closure in a conclusion, but closure doesn't always mean resolution. Right. So there are going to be times where maybe you're talking about bias in your essay, or you're talking about the impact of stereotyping. And maybe it's one of these things where it continues today. So it's not like, oh, I found a solution to this problem. Maybe it's bringing awareness that this is still continuously going on. Right. So when we think about putting conclusion together, here's what a kind of conclusion should do in general. Right. I don't know why it wants to move. So in general, your conclusion should restate your thesis statement, right? You could restate it, you could rephrase it, right? It could be kind of like, here's what I was basically like, you should remind your reader of what your essay has been arguing. And I don't think you need to kind of like word for word put what your thesis was, although you can. But I think rephrasing it, I like to think about it. I should probably change the wording on this. It's like, revisit your thesis statement. Kind of like remind yourself, like, reader of like, this is what the argument was that I was creating in my paper, right? That idea about, recapping your ideas or summing up your ideas, that's synthesizing your main points. Kind of like remind your reader of what the main ideas were that you were addressing in your paper. It doesn't have to be every single one of them, but it should be like, at least like, here's kind of like the big arguments that I was using to back up my thesis in my essay, maybe a couple of them, something like that. Because what you want to do is you want to like kind of call back to like, here are the ideas that I was using to support my argument, right? And remind that reader of like, these are the points that I wanted you to understand as you were reading through my essay. You should also kind of show your reader why these ideas should matter to them, right? It's not about, does the reader agree with your idea or disagree with your idea, right? But it's like, here's why this is important, right? There should be some sort of sense of like, here's these ideas, here's why they matter, right? Like, here's this kind of summation or summary of the ideas that I was presenting earlier in my paper. But the last piece of your conclusion, and this is what is really, really important, is that you're approaching some sort of sense of final analysis, some sense of closure. And like I said, closure sometimes can happen in a paper. Sometimes the paper ends open-ended, but there should be some sort of final version of so what, right? It's like, think about this idea of like, what do you want someone, think about a situation where maybe you have to have an important conversation with a friend or with a family member, right? Like there might be something that a conversation we want to have with a friend, right? And we want to say like, here's the points that I want to make, here's what I want you to understand. But in the end, that kind of final thing that you say, that's that final analysis. That's that last piece of it, of what you want them to understand. Like my kids always probably get like, I don't know, dread or whatever when like I have to have like the serious dad talk with them, right? Like maybe they're doing something like, the other day my daughter said she did homework but didn't turn it in or something like that. It's like, all right, now I got to go in your room and we'll have a conversation about this. But then when I get to the end of it, and then I say, okay, now at the very end, here is what I want you to understand. Like, here is why I'm talking to you about this, right? It's like, more than anything else, I want you to understand that like, you taking school seriously is important for these reasons, and I care about you and I care about your school. And the reason that I'm talking with you about this, or kind of, like lecturing to you about this, is because I want you to understand these things, right? And so it's like, that's that kind of big things. Think about what is that final takeaway that you want that reader to have. The reader is done with your essay, right? They're at the end, you got the reader for one more handful of sentences. What do you want them to walk away with having understood after they read your essay? What's their takeaway idea?
I think of documentaries. Like in a documentary, it gives you like all the information about stuff going on, and a lot of documentaries you watch will end with some kind of statement of like, we need to take action on this thing. Like this is why all this is important, and that's kind of what you're doing in the concluding paragraph. You're telling your reader like, I've given you all this information. Now here's like that greater context of why it matters to us.
Yeah, that's really great, right? Like that, like, why does it matter? Why should you care? What's their takeaway, right? This is kind of an easy way to think about, I like to visualize an introduction, or excuse me, an essay structure. It's kind of like this hourglass shape, right? Where it's like, remember we talked about like introduction is general in the beginning, you hook the reader, you bring the reader into the paper, it gets more and more specific as you build context. Your body paragraphs are your specific arguments. And then when you get to that conclusion, you kind of open it back out again, thinking about like, why should we care? Why does it matter? What is your final takeaway? Pulling back into the thesis statement of that idea. So if you kind of think about that, like general, very, very, very specific, kind of general out, like pulling out the camera, like wide angle lens kind of thing happening. And we see that happen with TV shows. We see that happen with movies, right? Like that very general in the beginning, kind of establishing context, bringing you up to speed with everything, very, very, very specific. And then at the end, kind of like, here's some takeaway. Here's the end of it. Here's everything kind of wrapping up nice. So it just kind of helps me visualize an essay, to think about it like that. So here's what to think about, right? These are each of those components, and just kind of some little pointers as you practice doing this in the next week in some change. Restate or rephrase your thesis. So you've spent your entire body of your essay proving your thesis, right? That's the goal of your essay. Your body of your essay is meant to be there to prove your thesis statement. So remind your reader of your thesis, right? Like remind the reader, here, this is what I was arguing throughout my essay. And I really think that like rephrasing, which is just kind of like paraphrasing yourself, like putting it in another way, maybe a little bit more of a simple way, maybe a more direct way, different words, so you don't feel like you're saying the exact same thing twice. But I think rephrasing your thesis can be really effective here. Just kind of like, here's what I talked about at the beginning, here it is again in the end, just to remind the reader of what the argument was that you were creating. So synthesizing the main points of your essay. Your reader just read your entire essay, and for the most part, especially as like we're sitting there and like just read it immediately, they can remember what they read, right? But sometimes it's important to help people like be reminded of those things. I think about that as like binge watching a TV show. Now, which is nice, is like on Netflix, you can skip the what happened last week on a TV show, which really says more about me and how much I love to watch, like binge watch TVs, where it's like last week on this show, I was like, I don't need to know about the last episode because I just watched it 30 seconds ago. Skip, and I just go directly on to the next thing, right? Because I can binge watch it when it's streaming. If I'm watching a show that only comes on once a week, sometimes I got to watch that like here's some stuff to refresh your memory so that I'm ready to watch the next show. I don't need to watch the whole episode again, right? And I don't need to maybe even watch the recap if I just watched it 30 minutes ago. So think about that maybe in the same way. Like your reader just read your entire essay. So you don't simply need to copy the exact points that you made in your body paragraphs again, because it's going to be repetitive for the reader. Instead, think about how you can revisit some of these key ideas so that your reader is kind of like nodding along with you when they get to that conclusion that you're about to make, right? So I think about that as like, let's imagine I'm creating an argument and I were to create an argument as to maybe something really simple, why you should eat at a specific restaurant. And then I build this whole argument and I'm like, first of all, the food is amazing. And I give all these different examples. And then I talk about like how friendly the people are who work there. And then I talk about like how beautiful the setting is when you sit outside, like that you're able to look out over the water or whatever, kind of perfect restaurant I create in my head. When I get to my conclusion, I might want to revisit my most important idea, which for me would be the food. And so I would say like, going to this restaurant and eating one of the best meals of my life, like I really would recommend you going there because their whatever is the best you've ever, like I would tie back into that idea, but I wouldn't go back through and list every single point that I made in my essay again because it's too repetitive. So instead, you about this idea of like, if I can call back to an idea that the reader was like, oh, that's a really important idea or a big idea that will kind of help the reader's head be nodding along as they're reading the paper, it kind of like, and we'll talk about this for the next essay, rhetorically, or that means of like persuading a reader and pushing a reader in your direction, it gets them to be able to kind of be on your side. Like we tend to see people try to do this, although this last set of debates wasn't a good example of strong debating skills, but we tend to see like politicians do this and their examples of like when they're creating their arguments, they get to this moment where they get to each person in debate gets like their closing time. They're like, you got 1 minute, go. And they'd be like, earlier I talked about how important it was to be able to, address coronavirus. I talked about how important it was to be able to create jobs in this country. I talked about this. Now, here is why it's important that you elect me, whatever, right? Like, because they go back, they revisit their key ideas, and then they say, now, moving this last point, so what? Help address this kind of like, why should I care question. Like, your reader's not an asshole, because that would be suggest I am, right? But like, I think importantly, just kind of think that like maybe your reader's a little bit skeptical. So it's not like your reader disagrees with you or they're like upset when they're reading your paper or they don't want to agree with your idea, but maybe kind of think, maybe my reader hasn't made up their mind. This is always a good strategy to think about. Like I like to think about this like kind of like on the other end of my paper, what I'm writing is somebody who's like maybe a little bit of a jerk, maybe doesn't fully agree with what I have to say, maybe, doesn't necessarily follow along with the premise of what I'm getting ready to put out there. And so when I'm writing, I want to write for that person. I want my ideas to be sharp. I want my examples to be clear. I want my analysis to be strong. And when I get to my conclusion, I want to address this question that this reader might be having kind of like a why should I care kind of version, right? So I think about that like this idea of like, I'm trying to prove it to that reader. And it's like, I'm not reading your papers that way when I'm reading your essays and grading for this class, but I think it's kind of, for me, it helps me visualize that person on the other end that I'm creating my argument to, that maybe this person doesn't want to follow along with it, but I'm going to create a strong enough argument where I don't really give this person an option. So even if they disagree with me 100%, I could be like, they could be like, that's a well-crafted argument. I don't agree with it, but it's well-crafted. So kind of like I said, that really helps to think about like writing for a skeptical or maybe kind of like a little bit of like I don't know if I want to buy along with this. Like, I don't know. I watch a lot of like Pixar movies, one, because they're awesome, but two, because I have a 7 and a 10-year-old. But like, if you've ever seen the movie Ratatouille, like the end of Ratatouille, and if you haven't, it's awesome little movie. But the end of it, like they have to cook for this food critic, and this food critic is like a total jerk, right? But like the idea is like when I think about the reader, and then the food critic ends up being awesome in the end, right? But I think about the idea of like write for someone who maybe doesn't want to follow along with your ideas. Like this food critic didn't want to see this restaurant succeed because it was all food being cooked by rats or whatever. I'm getting too into the weeds on Ratatouille, but it's an awesome movie. But I think about this guy and think about this idea of like he doesn't really want to see them succeed, but they're going to cook so well that he doesn't have an option but to do that. And so think about that. Like, your reader may not agree with your ideas, but they'll be like, that is a well-crafted argument. And this takeaway, this kind of why should I care, is being addressed when I get to that final point. And then also, this is a good strategy to have, because even if you do have a reader who 100% agrees with every idea, it's easier for them to be like, yeah, I'm like kind of nodding along and applauding as they're getting that conclusion, because like they're spot on with you, right? So either way, whether your reader is 100% skeptical or 100% for you, it's a good strategy, because it helps you either get those nods and get people going along with you, or it helps maybe convince people who aren't necessarily on board with what you're arguing. Any questions at all about that? I know I kind of said a lot there, but I think it's helpful for me to visualize like an audience in that way.
Is there like a minimum of like how long it should be, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the context, but I would say for essay number 2, I would say your conclusion should be somewhere between like a third of a page, half a page, something like that.
Okay.
So basically, the conclusion paragraph is going to be like the why you wrote it and why you chose your argument, right?
Yeah, it's that final, it's that kind of like why and so what, right? This is like, that's a really good way of thinking about it. And so like this kind of next piece like ties into this idea of like that final analysis is, what do you want your reader to kind of like walk away with? Like, they're leaving, they're walking away from your essay, just like before you get off the phone with that friend that you had this serious conversation. Maybe the thing you want them to understand is like, hey, like, I'm here for you if you ever need to talk, like I've got your back, whatever. All right, take care. Maybe the takeaway I want my kid to have after having that conversation about your homework is like, Dad loves you, I care about you doing well in school, and anytime that you have questions about your homework, like, feel that you can come talk to me, right? Like, it's that like, your reader's getting ready to walk away, right? Just like I finished Trevor Noah's book. I get to his very last page. I get to his very last paragraph. What does he want me to understand? And that's what he's getting ready to hit me with at the end there, right? Think about why your ideas should matter to your reader, and try to bring your reader back full circle to your introduction, right? So sometimes like maybe we start with a hook, maybe we start with a rhetorical question in the beginning of our essay, and maybe a cool strategy would be like, can I revisit that idea and pull the reader back to the beginning of the paper? But like I said, most importantly for your conclusion, this is your final chance to give a so what to your reader. This is your last handful of sentences. This is your last idea you can end. So here's what you want them to take away after having finished the essay. Think about like, I don't know, going to see, back when we used to be able to go to concerts, like if you ever got to see like a really good band or singer or somebody like that in concert, it's like they come back for an encore. They usually play the song that everybody loves. They usually kind of like finish where everyone's like, that was awesome, it's such a great concert, like that last song was amazing, right? Like they end with something big. They want to end with some sort of big takeaway. Here's what you should avoid in your conclusion, because there are some things that maybe you don't want to do. Try not to introduce a new idea in your conclusion that needs support. Meaning, like, don't open a new can of worms at the end that you're not planning on supporting. It could be something that maybe is like a final bit of analysis, but as far as like starting with like a whole new, completely different idea, and the reader being like, whoa, hang on, like it'd be like if the end of a movie, all of a sudden like some new character pops up, you'd be like, who the hell is that? Why is that person there? Now, obviously, those sometimes open you up for sequels, or at least like Marvel movies do that all the time. Like after the credits are over, they're like, here's a little something. Uh-oh, a new movie is coming out, right? But for your conclusion, like, try not to open up a new idea, because the reader is going to be like more lost than anything else. So make sure you're closing ideas and giving final analysis, instead of opening up a new idea that would be like something that would require support body paragraph. Don't end by just repeating your thesis without providing more analysis. So your conclusion should not just be like, I'm restating my thesis and now I'm done, right? Instead, it should be restating your thesis as a part of it, but the important thing is like, what is the final takeaway that you want a reader to have? Try not to bring out ideas that are out of character with the rest of the tone of your essay. So what I mean by that is like, what you don't want to do is like, let's say, for example, like you're writing this paper about like the negative impact that bias has on people, or the problems with single stories, or how they create stereotypes that are damaging to people. And then at the very end of your conclusion, you could be like, well, I mean, there are times where stereotyping can be really helpful. Be like, that's not aligned with the rest of the tone of your essay, right? So just kind of like make sure that you're careful with that, that like whatever ideas you bring up, like don't bring up something in your conclusion and that ties in with that new idea that doesn't really relate to what the rest of the essay is focusing on. Because the reader will be like, that's a little bit confusing because it's not necessarily tied into what the overall tone or the overall argument of the essay is. And then also don't include evidence like quotes or paraphrases that aren't sources in your body paragraphs. That's kind of that same idea of introducing new ideas, right? So like, let's say, for example, you're writing a paper, you're using Trevor Noah and you're using Blind Spot and you're using Adiche in this essay, and you have all of these different ideas and you're exploring them, you're writing this great analytical essay, and then all of a sudden you get to the conclusion and you pull out some random source that, or some other source you found online that deals with stereotype, and you're going to explore it. Conclusion is not the place to do that because it's going to require too much context for your reader, and it's kind of like introducing a new idea. So I would be really careful when you get to conclusion to think about, I'm going to pull out a completely new source that hasn't been introduced earlier on in the essay, because it's like opening up another can of worms or starting a new idea for the reader that the reader is not ready to have, right? It's just like introducing a new character in the very, very last minute of a movie. It's confusing and can kind of throw people off. Any questions at all on putting together conclusion paragraphs?
So you said not to introduce anything new. So we
Yeah.
really just kind of want to pull from what we already stated in our body paragraphs, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It doesn't mean no new thought or new analysis. What I would mean is just like not a new, completely different like effect or impact or idea to support your thesis. Because your analysis could be new, or could be like, you know, pushing further than you did earlier in the paper. But what I would mean by that is like, let's say you're talking about like how Trevor Noah's life was impacted by stereotype, and you were to say like it impacted his family dynamic and it impacted his opportunities in education, and those were the two big arguments you're creating in your essay. And then all of a sudden you get to the conclusion and you're like, it also impacted the friendships that he had with people. It's like, whoa, hang on, that's a new idea that's going to require, remember, if we think back to like talking about body paragraphs, it's going to require evidence and it's going to require analysis. And so what you've essentially done is, sometimes what will happen is, as writers, what we'll do is we'll like, oh, it's a cool idea, and we'll open up the possibility that could be a whole new body paragraph, and we'll try to do that at the very end. So maybe that is an idea worth exploring in your essay, but it doesn't belong in your conclusion, it belongs in the body of your essay.
So it's
Good
basically
question.
like closure, like you're having
Exactly.
closure with this, that, and that.
Yep, exactly. You're having closure, and you're kind of like that, giving that chance for the reader to be like, here is the final takeaway, or that final analysis that I want someone to understand after having read my essay. Good. Any other questions? Cool. So for this week, then it's just the works cited page, and then also, you know, working on the essay, and we'll continue to work on the essay into next week. It'll be due a week from this Sunday. And so as you're working though, I'll have my office hours next week, be able to meet with people, talk about anything you're writing. If you want to meet with me, meet with Chris, right? Like we can work through this essay, answer some questions, look at drafts of stuff, look at ideas you have. But as you're kind of moving forward, right, like works cited is due this week, and then kind of start thinking about like building that essay, putting your arguments together. We have the framed quotations that are now be able to pull into the body of your essay. You have your kind of plan on what you're going to be focusing on writing about. If any of that stuff feels unclear, if any of that stuff is things that you want to kind of check in on, if you feel like stuck on this essay, like a lot of times people feel like, you know, I can only go to an office hour or ask for help on an essay if I have something written and something for somebody to read. Like, please don't feel that way. Like, even if you haven't written a word yet and you're still like completely like, I don't know where I'm going to go. Like, I made that mistake a lot early on when I was writing essays where I was like, I don't think my ideas are ready to bring to my teacher's office hour because I was worried about like, they're going to want to see a completed essay. It's like, that's not the case. Like one of the most valuable experiences, or some of the most valuable experiences I had meeting with teachers in their office hours, was when I was still forming my ideas, or, hey, I'm stuck and I don't know what to focus on yet. Or I have a couple sentences and I want to know where to go with this. And so like that can be really, really helpful just to kind of start talking through ideas as you're forming them. So please, if there's moments where like any of you have questions, if you're working on something, like let me know, stop by my office hours, reach out to us. Like that's what we're here for. I'm able to make adjustments, meet with people at different times during the day. Met with someone the other night at 8:30 because they had to work into the evening. So it's like that we can find times that work for both of our schedules, that work for Chris's schedule, and be able to meet with you to provide that support. So please don't ever feel like your work assignment and you hit a wall and you kind of have to just try to like push through it. Like that's what we're here for, and to be able to help and support you through writing this assignment.
Yeah, that goes for me too. I'm going to try to be really open next week. So if ever you need to come talk to me, make a meeting, shoot me an email. It doesn't matter where you are in your process. If you're still like thinking of ideas, if you're confused about the reading, if you're pretty much done and just want like some feedback on what you've written so far, if you think it will be helpful to come talk to us, please come talk to us. It's all good.
Cool. All right. Thanks for stopping by. And then I'll have video posted for those of you who are here live now. I'll have this uploaded, and then this way people who are unable to make it will have access to it.